Welcome to Left on Red, where Gen X mom and gay millennial do socialism.
We've got left-wing views on news you can use.
I'm Susan.
And I'm Scott. Today we have a grad student from Columbia on with us. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi.
If you've been following the news as of the recording of this episode last Friday, but very recently, Columbia University here in New York chose to comply with the Trump administration's demands around a whole host of things. And I personally found it extremely shocking. I thought it was extremely shocking, one, the level of demands that the Trump administration leveled against the university, and two, that they complied. And it's now, as we're recording this episode, Tuesday night, and I feel like this just did not become a news story. And I know it's the combination of a Friday night announcement, and I know the Columbia board. I am personally just shocked that it wasn't a news story. And so I'm so glad you're here, Rachel, for us to try and make it one and to tell us about it.
I will say, I do think things are picking up in terms of coverage of what is happening right now at Columbia University. And I think it's interesting to start to see who is speaking against the sort of Trump administration, sort of Columbia University hostage situation where they're basically trying to hold the school for ransom vis-a-vis $400 million in federal funding. And we're starting to see, I think, people who have had sort of a academic freedom beat coming for this. And it's interesting that the issue of academic freedom is it's seeming like it's going to be what maybe flips public opinion on everything that's been going on at Columbia for over the past year. Personally, I think the experience of arriving at 116th Street, hopping off the train, viewing the university is one of just such complete degradation. I never felt like I was deeply invested in attending a university. I like reading and writing, but I don't think of myself as someone who is, gung-ho about being at school or being part of a university community. But it is just so incredibly dismaying to immediately be confronted with a whole security apparatus, police barricades, uniformed security guards standing outside the gates, lines of students waiting to show ID to get in, community members, other people queuing around, waiting to be granted permission to step into what until about a year ago was essentially a public space, essentially a park in Morningside Heights. And so just immediately you just experience this evil Empire University situation, just like a police state of university. And then on campus, it just gets worse and worse. And every single thing that has happened from the deportations, or the threats of deportations rather, to this recent capitulation has just further degraded the experience of being a student at Columbia. I think we're starting to see, and I don't know if this will hurt the university in the long run, but people reacting to that who are not students, people who are saying, I'm not going to come to Columbia, master's students are saying, I'm not going to spend tens of thousands of dollars a semester to receive this experience.
Can we maybe just back up for a second? Tell us what it's been like on the inside since, let's just say last April.
Since last April, when the encampments began, it was like a vision of what the university could be, and that was a beautiful moment with education and performance and free food and everything else going on, Cornell West giving speeches, etc. And then with the police crackdown, with the arrests, there was a sudden pivot. I remember distinctively, walking by this patch of grass, the university lawn, where they had the encampment, where, days before had been this sort of vibrant scene of resistance, and it was just completely empty, completely scraped, just dead grass, just empty space. And that's kind of what Columbia has felt like ever since. I will say, I think both among undergraduate students and graduate students, there's an environment of fear. People are scared of being surveilled, not only by the university, who has installed hundreds of new security cameras everywhere on campus, literal surveillance, but also the sense that people are scared to share things with their peers, scared to have certain conversations in public because they think they'll get recorded or think they'll get doxxed. People who are instructors, me when I was teaching a class last year, although I'm not teaching now, have sense and have students come to them and say, I have these concerns, I have these fears, but they won't bring them up in class. And that's troubling. I didn't ever think I was deeply invested in the idea of academic freedom and the campus as a space for expressing, different views. I didn't think I was deeply invested in the idea, but now that the idea is gone or we don't have it anymore, I realize I must have been deeply invested in it. I joke, now I'm going to be a free speech absolutist after this. Now that I've experienced the repression of political speech, which hasn't actually ever really happened to me or in my vicinity before. And I'm wow, I must really actually believe in academic freedom. I must really cherish free speech, which is not how I would have defined myself. Those are not political positions I would have upheld before this experience of the past year or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically of the free speech kind of people who make that sort of a primary goal as being like the Julian Assange, like fanboys, which like big respect, right? I'm not like saying I don't agree with them, but like that wasn't my primary struggle or even like a top 10.
I like that you brought it back to Julian Assange fanboys, because there was this like male-coded energy to the free speech absolutist before, and it was sort of not in a political freedom and flourishing way, but like the right to be kind of crass or say the R
Well,
word.
or also just kind of, yes, it's sort of that, but also like it was a masculinist expression amongst skinny guys who hang around computers, right? So it was like a weird form of like unconventional toxicity. And I would include people who were close to me in the past among that cohort. So it was like, we don't care about this. Well, you know, and so it was not a welcoming space for someone who might have said, well, what about like undocumented immigrants or exploited workers? Like it was definitely kind of a supremacist position.
This is an aside, but I also think it gets to this idea that I think a lot of men are drawn to a politics of like, don't tread on me, don't infringe on my right to say something or my independence. And so yet another moment of gender and politics, which we're going to glide over, because Rachel, when you're talking about this academic freedom thing, it's kind of funny. I also didn't think I cared about academic freedom. You know, I'm the token anti-intellectual. I'm obviously not an anti-intellectual, but 5 to 10 years ago, I would have been like, oh, those stupid little college students who are so privileged, right? And now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking exactly what you're describing. Like, yeah, there was this beautiful moment of protest of people doing and saying what they thought was right, risking their academic careers and their lives and their futures for what they thought was the right thing. And it was really beautiful. And so let's put a little bit more background, by the way, for those of you who don't know. Columbia is also unique because they have the Edward Said School, essentially of Middle Eastern studies. I don't remember the exact titles. And he was this preeminent Palestinian thinker and academic, and is responsible for a lot of modern theory and discussion around Palestine.
Yeah, he wrote a famous book called Orientalism that was about sort of centering Westernness as a way that we thought about places that were not Western, and kind of like really shaped most people's, I guess anybody on the left broadly understood view of sort of like neocolonialism or imperialism, or just like Eurocentrism.
And so Columbia prided itself on having this school with this preeminent thinker as, you know, the name previously there. And one of the demands, so the Donald Trump administration made these demands of Columbia, or else they would lose $400 million in federal grants, that school be put under receivership. So this beautiful bulwark of free thought and essentially academic protest against the dominant strain of imperialism here in the United States is now being put under Donald Trump's administration's receivership and control, that they would limit all different sorts of things in terms of protest on campus, that Columbia would adopt a definition of anti-Semitism that essentially says any protest of the state of Israel and its actions counts as anti-Semitism, a whole other host of these absurd infringements on free speech and free thinking, and Columbia chose to go along with it. And so I'm seeing all that and I'm like, this is horrible. This is really, we are not allowed to think independently anymore. So I'm feeling very
just
much
as
what
like
you're
a
saying.
bit of background, Columbia University has a $14.8 billion endowment, which is sort of like their fund that they manage. That's independent of like the money they use to operate the university itself.
The endowment's complicated, right? You can't like...
It's like little complicated. There's like, in my understanding, there are parts of the endowment that are liquid that Columbia would be able to draw upon to meet any deficits that are resultant of the cuts to federal funding. And I don't know where Yale is getting the money from, but it does seem like Yale is attempting to make whole certain research programs that were impacted by these cuts. So it's definitely a possibility, I think. And you would also think, I mean, Columbia has a massive fundraising drive each year where they raise raise millions of dollars. You would think that if Columbia has a liberal donor base after this point, or they could they could rally the resist libs to get some money to make themselves whole after these funding cuts. But yeah, I mean, circling back, Scott, to something you said a few moments ago, we see that the Trump administration has become super, super successful at banking on these attitudes you're describing of people just hating and detesting the idea that there are liberal students in these ivory towers who are studying goofy stuff, studying made up stuff, banking on a resentment towards those. And I think it really speaks to much broader issues in our society right now. There is there's a crisis in education. There is a strong sense that any form of investment in higher education doesn't pay off. There's a class divide. And if you do have the idea that there are elites who are, running around getting a free lunch at these institutions, Trump was able to bank on that hate super successfully to drive this wedge issue to attack higher education. And it's a highly effective strategy.
It's clearly an attitude I used to share. Yeah. And again, I don't think it was right or good. I've had many thoughts in my 30 years of life, but I understand where people are coming. I don't mean to say I understand where people are coming from, but I appreciate you pulling that out. That's exactly what's happening. And I know that probably a lot of Americans feel that way. Do you have any friends who are in that institute studying in or taking courses or teaching? I have no idea how a university works.
Yeah. So what's happening is Columbia has we could call it a school that is abbreviated as MISAS, which stands for Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. So we see broad swaths of academic research, past and present, different methodological approaches that are grouped together under this heading. So it's a department, and people who study this might study any of a vast variety of things. But Trump identified this department as a problem for its supposed promulgation of anti-Semitism. Thinking about a wedge issue, I mean, just like the Trump administration was able to take the idea of transness, able to take transgender people and use it as a battering ram to bust open and destroy public education in this country, using it to attack the Department of Education, the completely fictive commitment combating a fictive anti-Semitism is being used to attack higher education. But yeah, Trump in his ransom letter asked for this department, MISAS, to be put under receivership. And what I find just completely egregious is that Columbia has actually to some extent gone above and beyond Trump's demand to kind of re-steward this department and has taken basically every course, every class, every program, initiative offering that treats the Middle East and put it under a kind of review process, and has removed the capacity of faculty, so professors, to steward these courses, initiatives, etc., and has transferred that power to the administration, which is just a dire, an egregious, I think an unspeakable abridgment of academic freedom. It's just completely shocking. So yeah, rather than attempt to negotiate with the Trump administration, rather than suing the Trump administration, now as a group of faculty, Columbia faculty have just launched a suit, rather than just telling the Trump administration, they just caved. They just capitulated on some things are okay, more cops. Okay, mask ban. Obviously those things suck, but abridging the fundamental responsibility of the university, which is to, I think, guarantee academic freedom and promote freedom of inquiry into academic topics, is just so shocking. And it's so funny to me, we were saying, that I find it so shocking because I didn't think that this was a huge deal to me, but it is actually. It really is.
As someone who's been in this field, and by that I mean academia, for a very long time, I naively thought that Republicans and cultural warriors would only come for K through 12 because everyone does K through 12, right? So if you want to control Texas history textbooks so that it didn't talk about slavery, or you wanted to not talk about things like Reconstruction or the Ku Klux Klan or anything that had a negative light in American history, that made sense because K through 12 is pretty universal, whereas only 20% of Americans get a bachelor's degree and then maybe another 15 get advanced degrees. That's not even a majority, right? So you would think that that's a small number of people in in America who go through university, so they don't care about it as much. But there's something about the symbolic power of trying to get Columbia University to bend the knee. And I have no familiarity with elite institutions of higher education, right? I'm an entirely Big Ten educated professor teaching at a public university. But what makes a school elite is not just its history, but also like who they can attract and like who wants to be there and what they're associated with in the present. Allowing the Trump administration to do this, it just hurts everybody at Columbia. Even if you're studying like chemistry, or if you're like a professor of, I don't really know what Columbia has, I imagine standard liberal arts stuff, you're like, physics in the physics department, this also hurts you because it means that like Columbia doesn't value these things. And like a serious scholar, like, do they really feel like that's a place for them? I mean, I assume most people will stay on. That's bad for its reputation in so many ways among those who think that academic inquiry isn't of itself a value.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I mean, this is like a little bit less Columbia's reputation, but certainly other elite schools have this, Yale, which like the Bushes went to Yale, right? And were like members of Skull and Bones there or whatever. And certainly Harvard, which has like, the school of how to exercise American power and make war on people, whatever that like, whatever that program is at Harvard. Those are the institutions that have created the, American governing elite and that have shaped American foreign policy. So we're seeing, I think to some extent, like, is there a severing of the relationship? I mean, of course, Trump has this like populist demagogue identity, a severing of the relationship between the ruling elites, the president, of course, and elite academic institutions. And I think that is the optics. That is what Trump wants the public to take away from this. And that's why he's attacking these elite universities. And Susan, I've been really thinking and wondering, why Columbia, why Yale, why Princeton, why not public colleges, why not public universities, which is why aren't those being threatened with these funding cuts in this moment? I mean, Columbia and CUNY in New York City were really paired in their highly escalatory anti-genocide protests last year. But I think the optics are that Trump is repudiating an elite. But I actually think that at the same time, Trump is responding to the demands of elite donors, elites who are invested in Columbia, who sit on the board of trustees, who also have strong relationships with the Trump administration. So I think that's why it was only $400 million. I think that's why part of why Columbia was given the opportunity to meet these demands. If Trump, really wanted to take an axe to Columbia, he really, really could. But I think he wants to discipline Columbia, keep it on a short leash, but also preserve these institutions because of his relationships with their donor bases, with their trustees. They share support among the elite. But yeah, this question of, why is it Columbia? Why is it not CUNY? Because in my estimate, federal funding cuts to public universities, it would be like game over, whereas Columbia can kind of eat it. Yeah, it's a question that I've been thinking about.
This is like two big things here. The first is that Donald Trump does represent a unique break from the liberal world order and a lot of traditional liberalism. And so I'm beginning to think that some people are saying, oh, it's capital reasserting itself against the left. I do think Donald Trump is, in that way, more fascist in that he wants to also punish and discipline the liberals and the capitalists, right? That he wants to exert control. It's exactly like you were both saying. He is degrading American power, in part because he's disciplining this elite, this ruling class that he doesn't like. But Rachel, what you were just saying and what you were talking about earlier with regards to the endowment, how Yale is finding ways to fight back and how Columbia didn't, I think this is something else I've sort of concluded, which is looking at the threat to Columbia and looking at their choice so quickly to capitulate. The Columbia board, and I'm so sorry, the Amtrak freight line is coming by if you hear that, but I think the board on Columbia wanted to do this. I think they very much felt that the protests were unacceptable. I don't think they were ever supportive of the protesting students and faculty at any point. I think it's made up of, exactly as you described, a lot of people with relationships to the Trump administration, potentially with relationships to Israel, a lot of very wealthy, potentially Zionist forward folks. And I think they were happy to do this. I don't think they wanted to fight the Trump administration.
Yeah.
I think they were happy to have an excuse to say, oh yeah, we're doubling down on how much we hate these protests.
Yeah, and the line that Columbia is taking, I think that reading between the lines of these platitudinal emails the student body keeps receiving from the president, Katrina Armstrong, it seems like they were taken aback by the vehemence of the response, the critical response to their capitulation to the Trump administration. And in order to kind of set the record straight and be like, no, we're not colluding with fascists. We're not caving to authoritarianism. The line that they're taking is actually the demands that the Trump administration made in their letter are aligned with things that we already wanted to do and things that we had already decided to do. Like, we had already decided to try to restrict the usage of masks on campus. We had already decided to introduce like almost 40 additional campus police officers with the power to arrest students. Apparently, they were already training those officers before the Trump letter arrived. They already wanted to sort of re-administrate or put into receivership the departments and programs focused on Middle Eastern studies. And so it's a really curious defense if it is that. It's like, oh, like, actually, you know, we're not collaborating. It's just that what we wanted is really closely aligned with what the Trump administration wants.
I don't know. I don't believe it, though. I don't believe it, because if that's true, they would have just done it, right? If they, okay, like, nothing stops the university administration from removing the head of a department and putting in somebody else in, right? That's a move. As somebody who has been a chair of a department and has also watched other departments been unable to elect a chair, then our administration goes in and picks somebody, or they hire someone to run it. No. We know the way that governance works at universities. Universities can always rearrange. They can shut down departments on their own. These things happen all the time, right? We shut down an department at our school because of an enrollment issue, right? People were angry, but they dealt with it. So if they wanted to do these things, they would have done it themselves in September. But they didn't, right? They didn't actually want to do these things at all. I don't believe it. Maybe like 20% of that is correct.
Yeah,
if they wanted to make these changes, they would have done them.
I don't think the argument is they wanted to make these changes, and so they secretly got the Trump administration to make them do it. I think it's more when these changes came down, they were not so unhappy about them. They were like, oh, these suck, but...
Okay, but there's something very different about federal government receivership and then having a department radically restructured by university administration. One of them is unheard of. Like, federal governments do not put academic departments under receivership. That is not something that ever happens. Versus, like, we're going to merge you with a different department. We're going to help rewrite your bylaws. Like, that's not something that they can
Is there a better
defend.
explanation for why they just did it? They could have fought it harder, no?
I think that parts of the Columbia administration are representing themselves accurately here. How much was this a collaborative project? Like, how much was there, discussion between and among representatives of Columbia University and the Trump administration about how to craft a set of demands that the university would be able to, was willing to, wanted to meet? Is that a possibility? Like, I don't know. We'll probably never know unless we get added to some, like, secret chat we're not supposed to be in and see them discussing it. But, I think that the question here is Columbia capitulated immediately, did not attempt to negotiate the terms. In some cases, went above and beyond the terms. And I feel like that the willingness that signals, suggests that these things were of interest to Columbia, were priorities for Columbia.
Or some of them were. I don't know, like, there must be pressure happening from key donors.
Oh, certainly.
That they feel
100%.
like, oh, we're not going to be able to afford to exist. And that, like, this could be like, a hands tied situation. It's like, oh, we just didn't have any power. But like Columbia, if they didn't like student protesters, they could have negotiated with them at any point too. And said, hey, if you all clear, we'll meet with all the student leaders and have a discussion and see what we can do. Because other universities, they didn't have protests last that long. They didn't get to the point of like having to clear encampments because they said, all right, you want to have a discussion about our endowment, you want to have a discussion about our investments, let's do it. And there were student leaders and there were discussions and like plenty of places, they didn't give in to 100% of student demands. They would never do that, right? But they compromised and they did something. I mean, I think this is like a crisis in the identity and the purpose of these elite institutions in some ways, because they serve so many different purposes that they're doing a bad job at doing any of them, right? They're not just places of elite education. They're not just places of social reproduction for like the elites. They're not just places for some of the best research and discovery. They're not just hedge funds and real estate investment vehicles. They're all those things. And a lot of these things are they don't work together, right? They work at crosshairs. And so now what you're getting is something incredibly incoherent, something that seems to work against the short, medium, and long-term goals of Columbia University as a place that, among other things, grants degrees. It's a weird moment. I was talking to a friend of mine over Instagram because like I'm like a real boomer in my music tastes, and like the Neil Young song Ohio about the Kent State massacre came on, right? And Kent State was like a CUNY, right? Like working people sent their kids there. We call them directional schools, but they're like state schools that aren't like the flagship, and they're not urban comprehensives either. And so this is like a regular working people school. Your average American has a college degree from a school like Kent State. So it's not an elite school, not even like the flagship institution of the state public university, but, like a regular institution that largely draws on a regional student body. So Kent State was very different because it was this like a very accessible and more like democratic institution with a clear purpose, right? They gave degrees. And so this focus is new. There is something significant about Columbia that kind of like overestimates the influence of Columbia because it is so small, but sort of also correctly assesses the importance of Columbia because it is symbolically so powerful. Yeah, it's just the way that this collusion is happening in which their students are now so vulnerable. I mean, their professors are vulnerable, now their students are vulnerable. Their students are vulnerable to being deported to places where they don't live.
And we haven't even mentioned that they essentially kidnapped Mahmoud Khalil.
Right. We haven't talked about that. We haven't talked about the young woman from South Korea who's a permanent resident who's been living here since she was 7, who is now like on the run. Like
and
that is.
University seems to, if not.
They warned her.
Yeah, they seem to, if not be complicit in these things and potentially giving the administration information about Mahmoud Khalil, for example, they seem to be doing absolutely nothing to protect.
They're doing less than nothing. I mean, the reason that the graduate student who supposedly self-deported left the country, the reason that she left the country after learning that ICE was arriving at her place of residence, a Columbia University housing place of residence multiple times a day, was because Columbia revoked her student status, meaning she was no longer a student at Columbia, meaning she no longer had any status to remain in this country. Had Columbia supported her and not revoked that status, she would have had the capacity to remain in the country at least a little while longer after her visa was revoked by the Trump administration. So they're doing less than nothing. The disciplinary records, the disciplinary proceedings that Columbia chose to pursue against students who participated in protests are the foundations for the Trump administration's deportations. And had Columbia elected to, maintain a consistent course of action consistent with previous rounds of student protests, even notoriously previous campus building occupations, and simply dropped the charges, the Trump administration would have had far less ability, I think, to identify these students, far less ground to deport them. I mean, thinking about this shift at Columbia, it seems clear that Columbia, before the Trump administration ransom letter, and I would say maybe even before the encampments, is choosing to pivot to the right, to shed its identity as the protest university, to leave behind that legacy, which formerly it cashed in on, and become a different kind of institution. Associated with that are all kinds of other restructurings. The steady decline in admissions in graduate student humanities programs, for example, is more evidence of the reconfiguration of Columbia University. So like many influencers, like a whole bunch of people, institutions like Target, when it's got rid of its DEI stuff, Columbia is rebranding, and in this sort of moment, they're rebranding as conservative.
Yeah, it feels like listening to you talk about how they've essentially put their students in danger rather than protect them and all these other changes. It's not even a question now of is the board and is the leadership of Columbia happy about these things or encouraging them. It seems clear that this is something they've wanted to do, have encouraged, have enabled, and like you described, essentially set the stage for the Trump administration to do these things. I'm glad you pulled it out to Target and influencers and so many other folks, because I was thinking about it. There was that news story last week where this law firm, and it's like a guy's name, Paul Stein, essentially agreed. The Trump administration banned this DC law firm from coming into certain federal buildings, which, by the way, seems illegal or unconstitutional, whatever. It's banned several law firms from this. Most law firms have engaged in lawsuits as a result, saying you're not allowed to do this. This is what we're legally entitled to for our jobs. And this law firm instead gave Donald Trump a bribe. They agreed to donate $40 million to some of his campaign or his business or whatever, and agreed to do things that he wanted. And he said, okay, you guys are no longer banned from our agencies. Columbia, when they also fired the UAW union president there, Grant Minor, that was not also one of the things the Trump administration demanded of them. So you have these examples of institutions like Columbia, the phrase that we've seen online about fascist governments, complying in advance. Basically saying, we're not going to fight you, and we're actually going to give you ideas, and we're gonna do things that you want rather than argue with you. Oh, this fascist government is doing something that's removing my freedoms. I'm going to do whatever you ask. And it's so troubling that very powerful liberal institutions are doing this, because I imagine when you see the administration and other forces kind of come down on much less powerful people, on individuals like Grant Minor, on people like Mahmoud Khalil, on like regular activists, so many people are saying, I'm principled, I'm not going to give up, you're going to have to arrest me, you're going to, I will pay with my life for this freedom. And the most powerful people in the world who don't have to pay with their lives, who have the money and the resources and the reputation to fight this, are all instead saying, okay, whatever you guys say, don't be mad at me. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the project of the Trump administration in letting all of the weight, like letting the heavy come down on specific people who they themselves make social media posts about, just the egregious callousness and stupidity, the stupid cruelty of this administration. Yeah, making an Instagram post that said like, Shalom Mahmoud. Insane. Like getting surveillance footage of an airport where this Columbia student who left the country is shown dragging her suitcase behind her, passing through security, kind of making these very, very public punishments seems, first of all, like a fear tactic. When it's not happening to someone anonymous, when it's happening to someone with a name and a face, like that is specific and that is frightening, but also allows them to keep sort of feeding a public that craves these punishments, which is like, a much deeper and more troubling dynamic in our society that people are, I guess if I want to do, kind of a materialist or whatever analysis, like people feel like they have been punished for so long that they haven't succeeded, and they want to see someone like get it. They want to see someone punished, which is really messed up. But
right.
Yeah,
it's like a bloodlust almost, but it's geared towards the Columbia students. No one feels bad for them because they have to be really fancy.
Yeah, no one feels bad for them because they're elites. They're the liberal elite, and they got what was coming to them, and they shouldn't have protested. And protest is like being configured as like a privilege. It's a privilege to protest. Like I could never do that. Like
no, it doesn't even seem like it's a privilege to protest anymore. What it is, it's like a crime. Like protesting is now a crime. Protesting is a form of delinquency.
It's a form of deviance, also.
And it's also a form of racism. Like we don't have time to talk about this, but the way that the anti-Semitism has been, accusations have been weaponized by people who are probably also actually very anti-Semitic is something we can save for another day. Like nobody there cares about people's religious freedoms.
The idea that Trump is a stalwart defender of Jewish people is laughable. When you remember in his last campaign, when he had that ad where it was like Hillary Clinton, some stacks of dollar bills, and then like the Star of David, and that was like a freeze frame in one of his campaign ads, he ran on anti-Semitic dog whistles, and he's still dog whistling, like louder than ever, barely even concealed anymore.
We have to do an episode about the ways in which exactly what we're describing are not a problem for a lot of Zionists, because it reminds me of the black and white supremacist movements or separatist movements sort of being somewhat aligned, because they were both saying we want to live separately from each other. Essentially, it's a lot of Zionists in the United States are fine with that sort of anti-Semitism in these political figures, because they're sort of admitting, every racist, every racial supremacist essentially is admitting here, humanity cannot live in peace in a multicultural society. We're always going to hate each other. And so the only permanent long-term answer to all of these prejudices is that we all have our separate states and that we all live in these ethno-states separate from each other.
Yeah.
I kind of want to go back to this idea of an identity crisis for Columbia University, and also what is it like for students on a day-to-day. We know that Columbia University has had like a weird past around protesters anyway, which I didn't know about before, but like you came in with a certain set of expectations, and then this has all been happening now for the past year or so. What's it like on a day-to-day basis? What's the climate like politically, socially for somebody walking around the Columbia campus and, ostensibly attending courses, going to meetings, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I actually came into Columbia, not with actually great expectations for the institution, but one of the major reasons was because the graduate students there, the graduate student workers, were about to win a contract, and I thought it would be better to be a unionized graduate student than to not be one. So I think I approached the university with a somewhat antagonistic relationship, since, I walked into basically like a strike situation as a student entering a PhD program. The union, the Graduate Student Workers Union has been like a major player in everything that has happened on campus since last spring and before. There's a bunch of different things happening. There's a bunch of misinformation circulating on campus, I think especially among undergraduate students who seem to think that, rumors have been circulating that if Columbia had not given in to the Trump administration, it would have meant tuition increases. There's a climate of fear around the idea that, who's going to be deported next. And I think, the shift from, example, targeting someone like Mahmoud Khalil, who was highly visible, was a lead negotiator between the student encampments in Columbia, to someone like the recent undergraduate student who you mentioned, who has been in this country since she was 7 years old, is, a naturalized resident, and now they're coming after her. First of all, she's not a graduate student. Second of all, she's not a leader in the protest. She's someone who, as a person, moved by an ongoing genocide, just decided to participate in protest as a participant, exercising a free speech that Columbia and Barnard, the partner institution, base their institutional identity on, or have in the past. So I think that there's really, among graduate students, among undergraduate students, a climate of serious fear. Graduate students fear that if they're international, they lose their visas, their income will be completely cut off. They will be in a country that they maybe don't have a firm financial or social foundation in without any money. And so, the effect of this, I worry, will be to chill protest responses. People are saying, international students in particular, are saying, like, I would love to come to that protest. I would love to come out, but I can't be targeted by the university. I can't take an arrest. So now that the fear of arrests is present at all protest events, and that's deeply chilling. The student workers of Columbia, the union, will be negotiating their second contract in the very near future, actually basically now. And the idea that every picket, every union rally, every action will carry the threat of arrest is deeply chilling to the possible of meaningful labor action. It's union busting. Columbia's collusion with the Trump administration, Columbia's doubling down on the policing of campus is a form of union busting. That's part of it too. But I would just say, the day-to-day experience is bad. It's bad. I feel deeply grateful and privileged to have spent, some years in a space, felt like a beautiful space to learn and experience things. There were lectures to attend, concert series. I would ask my girlfriend, I would ask a friend, hey, do you want to check out Sadie Hartman giving a lecture? Do you want to see this 18th century German music performance? And people could just walk onto campus and attend that. Now they can't. They can't come onto campus. You have to request permission to have a friend come onto campus to attend a concert, a film screening, to visit the art gallery, anything at all. It's abysmal. And just with the gates being closed, it's like being in a fortress. It's like being in a police state.
And for people not familiar with the geography of Columbia, it's in Uptown. It's 116th Street, and it kind of occupies, this green space kind of occupies an avenue. And by cutting off the green space, it cuts people off to different parts of Harlem, I guess. And so access to the A train, to the 1 train, right? It should be a public space.
Thinking of DEI, it's literally an access issue, because anyone who, might walk a little slower for any reason, if they're older or whatever, instead of being able to take a 3-minute walk from Amsterdam to Broadway through Columbia's campus, now has to go around, and it takes me 15 minutes to walk around campus. And I can imagine if, you were an elderly person or someone using any kind of mobility aid, and Columbia, has just kept these gates closed for over a year now.
And it's very much symbolic of how Columbia sees itself in general compared to the broader New York City community, which is that it doesn't pay taxes, but it owns a lot of property and uses that property to build up its portfolio.
In fact, there is a state bill, or I should say a package of bills, part sponsored by Assembly member and mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani, called the Repair Act, to make it so that Columbia and other private universities, I think specifically it's Columbia and NYU here in New York City, to pay taxes and to direct those taxes towards our public universities instead. So you should check that out.
Yeah, I was telling someone, I was saying I'm actually kind of ashamed to tell people I go to Columbia. It's not something I say with pride anymore, even though it's not my fault that Columbia is colluding with fascists. But he said to me, it's okay, just tell people you go to CUNY Morningside Heights. And I was like, oh yeah, God willing, from your lips to God's ears, we will nationalize Columbia University.
Municipalize.
We'll municipalize.
Yeah, because right now Donald Trump is kind of nationalizing it, and it's not going in that direction. Well, this was really, really great, Rachel. And you made me think of, I was only ever on the Columbia campus once, and it was several years ago, alongside 32BJ, because we were protesting. So I was a protester on the Columbia campus. This is when we were protesting. Columbia had a member of the Starbucks board doing a talk. And so we were handing flyers out to people about this board member's role in Starbucks union busting, because 32BJ was collaborating with Workers United on unionizing Starbucks. That was a fun event. And now you can't walk through Morningside Heights. It was really great talking to you. I appreciated thinking about not even, we can do the news and we can talk about all the things that happened, but I appreciated getting this emotional sense of what it's like to be a student, a grad student, connected to the university, and what it means for the rest of us. Susan and I obviously don't go to Columbia, don't have like a personal connection. Obviously, we live in New York City.
I was waitlisted to the PhD program there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But clearly, not good enough for Columbia. So that's why I've got an all Big Ten university education.
Yeah, well, it worked out, but it's a university that looms large in the public imagination. The media covers it a lot. And I've come around to I used to be very much those people you were describing, a little resentful of the privileged students. And I used to not understand why there was so much focus on these elite universities. And I've sort of come around to the idea, one, they get a lot of public attention. They matter a lot for setting public agendas. They can be places of great academic freedom, pushing forward the boundaries and ideas of what we're thinking and discussing. But also, they're creating the next elite. The ruling class of the United States is being developed in these universities. And so what happens there is deeply important and will impact all of us. And so we should care about these places being good and less evil. But maybe the ship is sailing on that.
Yeah. I mean, now we are forced to care about them, whether it's important for us to or not, because they are functioning as this wedge issue, this attempt to reconsolidate public opinion in the favor of fascism. So, whether or not the elite university was worth thinking about before, which I honestly think is debatable, it's certainly worth thinking about now.
And also the ideas that circulate around elite universities trickle down to public universities too. Because if people have like disgusting feelings like, oh, these are terrible places about universities, the right has done such a good job of making it seem like that universities are places of cultural Marxism. And we always have a joke, which is like, I can't get my students to do the reading. Why would I get them to take my opinions, right? Like I can't get them to like, send me an email or come to my office hours. So why on earth do they listen to me? Which of course they wouldn't, a right-wing person on Fox News wouldn't understand that. And that I've spent my whole career being taught how to teach new cohorts of students. Like now we're always getting how to teach Gen Z. Like I'm always being trained on how to teach Gen Z students because they're like, you definitely cannot understand what goes on in a Gen Z person's brain.
We need to get Susan on TikTok.
No,
We need Susan when the child is T. Susan needs to.
The gag is finna.
No, I'm just like, what does it mean to reheat nachos? I'm like, no, I don't. My kids are Gen Alpha. Like that's all. I have enough proximity.
And by the way, everyone messed up the reheating nachos, but I have to accept that language evolves. It was originally, so the nachos thing was originally, let's say Susan is a CUNY professor, and then let's say I started becoming a CUNY professor. You would say, oh, Stylianos wants Susan's nachos. But because I think Lady Gaga reheated her nachos, because she took something that she had done many years ago and simply brought it back in a different way, everyone started using the reheating nachos as the wanting someone's nachos.
Okay. But you know what? As an academic, Rachel must know this well. Most really famous and prominent academics are just constantly reheating the same nachos.
They're definitely reheating nachos.
Yeah. And then, but it's like, I've been doing this now for over 20 years. So they get like real congealed and nasty.
We need to protect their freedom to reheat those nachos.
Right. Keep reheating those nachos, but with like slightly different toppings. Hatch peppers, sun-dried tomatoes, just
We need to reheat Columbia's protest reputation nachos.
So we're not saying that Columbia University is the most important fight, but rather that this has become such an important issue for the Trump administration. And just like trans kids, just like the hundreds of people who are 150 years old drawing Social Security, right? This narrative of like cheating, it's bad, all this stuff. And it's our job as leftists to resist, defend, protect ideas like not just academic freedom, but also really basic human rights like your freedom of assembly, your right to due process. Now we're just talking about liberal ideas.
Oh my God, we're defending liberalism.
Right, yeah. Yeah, truly. Like, we're just libs.
Liberalism was a progressive evolution from what was before. I think that's fine.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
I mean, I'm a human rights scholar and I always get yelled at for being a dumb lib, but who's a dumb lib now?
Yeah,
Me.
this is a horrible note for us to end this on. Rachel, can you end us on something that's not defending liberalism?
I mean, I'm feeling hopeful. Colombia failed to stand up to the Trump administration. I hope someone else looks at that and is like, that was a really dumb move, and decides to stand up to the Trump administration. I hope that resistance continues on campus. And I also hope that these egregious violations of constitutional rights, like as is the case with Mahmoud Khalil, are mobilizing of like the liberal progressive base of organizations in that base, and to cohere some kind of fight back, which has been unfortunately absent. I think these issues are broad enough and frightening enough that they could cohere and mobilize a base to stand up to Trump. So that's not, something that comes out of Columbia University, but the sequence of events that led up to the detention of someone like Mahmoud could be a powerful catalyst, and I think already is to some extent.
That's a much better way to end than my being a lib. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for coming on and talking to us about an issue that we'll probably continue to think and talk about for a little while now. Well, I'm Susan.
I'm Scott.
And solidarity forever.